One.
Hey, good morning, everyone. This is exciting. This is our first virtual lecture that we've ever done. And hopefully by next fall, we will be back to our old lectures in the KIA with the wonderful treats afterwards and lots of socialization. But thank you for joining us on this first, our first endeavor. We have over 55, I believe, signed up for the lecture. So I'm not going to babble on here. I want to get this, get us off and rolling. So two things for those of you that are just joining. We need you to look at the lower part of your screen. There's a little mute. It looks like a microphone. If you would click on that so that there'll be a red line through it and you'll be muted so that there's a lot of background noise that you don't even think about that gets picked up. So if you could mute that. And then to view Diana's lecture slides, in the upper corner of your Zoom window, it says speaker view. If you click on that, then you will be able to see the full screen slide lecture, okay? I think, so that's the main thing, to click the mute button. I think I've got everything. So I'm going to introduce Barbara Brose, you all know Barbara, who will introduce Dr. Greenwald to all of you. So welcome and thank you for coming.
Hello, everyone. Got to put these on now. Okay. In mid-July 2019, when we first officially asked Dr. Diana Greenwald to join our illustrious cadre of speakers, who happened?
Barbara, you're muted. Barbara, you're muted. Diana, can you unmute Barbara?
I got it.
Okay.
Is that it? Okay, start again. Hello, everyone. In mid-July 2019, when we first officially asked Dr. Diana Greenwald to join our illustrious cadre of speakers, who in Art League would have imagined there wouldn't be the traditional celebration with food, beverages, live music to mark the beginning of this 66th lecture season. And yet we are here with a speaker whose knowledge and ability to engage our minds inspires us to look back and to look forward at the same time. Not only will the recording of today's lecture be on Art League's website, but you will also find other links, including one to the speaker's new book, Painting by Numbers, Data-Driven Histories of 19th Century Art. Painting by Numbers is not about those art kits you may remember or may have turned to during the coronavirus. Princeton University Press describes it as a book that upends traditional perspectives and offers an innovative look at the 19th century art world and its legacy. I think you'll find it interesting. Remember, links and virtual lectures are free this year, and you're invited to share them with friends all over the world. Our speaker, Diana Greenwald, earned her graduate degrees at University of Oxford with an MA in Economic and Social History and a PhD in History. Subsequently, she became an Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., an appointment based on rigorous scholarship and, among other things, the desire to work collaboratively. Her CV lists numerous awards and honors, publications, and museum projects. She is currently the assistant curator of the collection at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. Diana, welcome to Kalamazoo.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And I'm thrilled to be here. I hope everyone can hear me. So give me a thumbs up if you can. Great. Okay. So today I will be talking about the Gardner, where I currently work, and its sort of lesser known masterpieces and 19th century treasures. As the kind of subtitle of my scholarly book alludes to, I'm an expert in the 19th century and I love talking about it. So I'm going to share with you some of my favorite pieces from the collection where I currently work. But before we get there, what is the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum? And some of you probably know the answer to this, but it's always worth a refresher because we're a pretty exceptional place. So this imposing looking lady on the slide is Isabella Stewart Gardner. She, like me, is a native New Yorker, was a native New Yorker who transplanted to Boston after marrying Jack Gardner, who was the member of a major Boston family. She and Jack traveled the world between 1867 and 1895. She actually went to 37 countries by current borders. She made it all the way to Angkor Wat, even in 1883. And sort of after all of these travels, she sort of dabbled in art collecting prior to that, but in the mid 1890s, she becomes a major art collector and is best known for collecting old masterworks. I'll show you a couple of those, but actually her collecting tastes are really wide ranging. They include non-Western art, many 19th century works, sort of contemporary art of her time. So it's not just a Renaissance collection, which is what we tend to be known for. She had the museum in mind during her lifetime. Actually, she and Jack discussed it. And when Jack passed away suddenly in 1898, she actually broke ground on the museum less than 3 months later, or bought the land, and started building it in 1899. It was called Fenway Court at the time when it opened in 1903. And after she died in 1924, it was renamed the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And the thing we're probably most famous for, apart from a theft in 1990, which I'm happy to answer questions about if you're curious, is that Isabella's will is quite strict. And so within our historic space, and I'll show you some images of this, we actually can't rearrange our collection. She wanted everything to be just as it was when she died. So a little bit more background. If anyone is familiar with Boston, that little green dot is where the Gardner is. We're right next to the Fens, not far from Fenway Park. Now this is kind of the heart, right in the middle of Boston. During Isabella's lifetime, it would have been quite far out on her own. And so this is what the museum looks like from the outside, not necessarily particularly exciting. But if you look inside, and this is probably the view we're most famous for, we have this beautiful interior courtyard, and Isabella arranged the entire museum around it. The standard kind of description is that we are like a Venetian palazzo. This is one of Isabella's photos of a Venetian palazzo that she loved, turned inside out. And once you go sort of behind the courtyard into our galleries, they look like this. So they're very particular. This is a Titian. This is the Rape of Europa. It's one of Titian's most famous works. And you'll see that Isabella has arranged it in a very particular way. If you look at the white tapestry underneath the Titian, that's actually a portion of Isabella's, one of her favorite ball gowns, designed by Worth in the 19th century. And this is absolutely typical of her arrangements. You will have a priceless work of art next to something of great personal value to her, but no particular financial value. Also on these chairs, there's actually, if you see a little round blue plate, that's an Islamic art plate. I mean, she really went for it with the various combinations of things. I'll show you one more gallery view. This is one of my favorite paintings in the collection, maybe for a future talk. It's a Rembrandt self-portrait. This is in our Dutch room. And Isabella might call something Dutch, but in this one Dutch room, I think by last count, there are things from about 30 different cultures or countries. So she was a cultural omnivore for sure. So that's the old part of the collection. I'll just give a brief plug for the fact that the Gardner, while technically frozen in the historic galleries, is a quite vibrant, contemporary, well, we do have a contemporary art program, but I should say a vibrant modern museum. This is a lovely view of our modern edition. And so the way that we work at the Gardner is we have special exhibitions in this space, both about historic art and contemporary art. And then you might be able to see my cursor. There's a little breezeway that connects this to the palace, which is that courtyard space with the historic galleries. So don't worry, we're not going to spend too much time with Renzo Piano. Today is all about the 19th century. And so I'm going to be, or I should say 19th to very early 20th. I'm going to be talking about 3 works today, 3 of my favorites. One is Edward Manet's Madame Manet, then John Singer Sargent's Incensing the Veil, and finally Henri Matisse's Terrace at Saint-Tropez. So we'll kick it off with Manet's Madame Manet. And here she is, looking kind of dark and imposing. Isabella hated artificial light. This is actually a problem for us because then you can't really see the art. So we're actually relighting. So you'll see that Madame Manet looks kind of dingy in this photo. You can't really see any detail. So I'll be talking about this detail. And this is what she looks like when she's lit properly and photographed in our lab. So this is a portrait. It's a quite early Manet portrait from 1863, and it's an image of his mother. And I'll tell you a little bit about Edouard Manet and his biography, a little bit about this subject, his mother Eugénie Manet, and what are some of the inspirations that Manet is pulling on when he was painting this at the very beginning of his career. So some of you have likely heard of Edouard Manet. He's often kind of heralded as the father of modern art. He was born in 1832 to a quite wealthy bourgeois French family. He was supposed to be a lawyer. He did not do very well at school, so he couldn't become a lawyer. His father, who was a Ministry of Justice official, wanted him to become a naval officer. Fun fact is actually Manet actually went on a boat to Rio de Janeiro in the 1840s in order to try and qualify for the Navy. He also failed at that. And it turned out the thing he was really good at was art and painting. His father wasn't a huge fan of this path. His mother, on the other hand, was much more artistic and quite supportive of her son. So eventually Edouard wins out and he's allowed to start trying to become an artist. And so he's best known for these large salon paintings. So the Salon was the major public exhibition in France in the 19th century. This is Olympia from the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And Manet is known for creating shocking images. So this image would have evoked a Greek goddess perhaps, but it's very clearly a French prostitute of the 19th century. And this shocked the Parisian art world. So he has a habit of engaging with old master themes and kind of plugging in contemporary life and freaking out all the 19th century French people along the way. And with this sort of shock factor and this interest in contemporary life, he becomes the hero of the Impressionists. Another fun Manet fact is that he was constantly confused for the younger Claude Monet of water lily fame during his lifetime, which he got very annoyed by, but they sort of have good-natured letters back and forth about getting confused for one another. So sort of Manet in a short bite. So we'll learn a little bit more about Eugénie, the subject. This is actually a later painting that Manet did of his mother, much freer in brushwork. So she is, as is written on the slide, from quite a colorful family, a family that, though French, had deep roots in Sweden and actually helped install the still current Swedish monarchy. And they were quite an artistic family. So Eugénie was a fairly accomplished pianist. She encouraged her 3 sons to be musical and artistic, and she was Manet's greatest supporter in a lot of ways, both financially once his father passed away, but also as his host, even after his marriage. And there's kind of a complicated family story there about him and his wife, but even after his marriage, Eugenie was his host. She helped host many famous artists at the Manet family home. He lived with his mother. He and his wife lived with his mother for most of his life. So she was very, very important to him. And so before we get back to our wonderful painting, I want to show you the other early portrait that features his mother. And so this kind of awkward double portrait of Manet's parents shows his father Auguste on the left, and that's Eugenie again on the right. And if things feel a little bit frozen in this portrait, it's because Auguste, despite being kind of fancy Ministry of Justice official, was actually suffering from tertiary syphilis at the time, which had paralyzed his face and half of his body. So Manet is doing his best to present his father in a flattering light, but his face was already sort of half frozen. So you end up with this half downward look, and the artist has positioned his mother, Eugenie, behind Auguste to make the scene seem a little bit less awkward. But the whole setting doesn't necessarily look particularly inviting, and Eugenie has to stand behind her husband. If you look at Eugenie's hands, and I'll see if we can get my cursor on there, I want you to pay attention just to this gold band, and also to the fact that she has a downward cast gaze, because we're going to look at how Manet changes this after Auguste dies in 1862, and he paints Eugenie in 1863. So if you look closely, there's that gold band again. It's her wedding band. She still would have been in a mourning period when Manet paints this. But rather than be cast down and sort of in shadow behind her husband in the double portrait, we have her staring directly at the viewer. Her skin is much more luminous. Her eyes, we see, are actually light colored. Manet was famous for being kind of handsome and also having light eyes, and we can see where he got it from. And so even though she's draped with a black headdress and her clothing is dark, and we know that the setting is one of kind of the first few months of widowhood, I actually think she looks much more brilliant and she has the space to look almost shining in this painting. That may or may not be a reflection of kind of Manet's feelings about his father, but anyway. The other very clear influence that's going on here is that at the time, Manet, who is enrolled in art school but doesn't have the most formal education, was really interested in Spain and Spanish art, and different Spanish art collections that are coming through Paris at the time, and prints of Spanish art. So he's particularly interested in Velázquez and Goya. And I think you can see, even in this early portrait, he's beginning to cast people he knows, in this case, his mother, as if they are in an old master painting. So, we see the black fabric over Eugenie's hair, very reminiscent of a Goya, and the really limited palette. I mean, he's really only using brown, red, black, and white to do a lot of this work. Maybe a touch of green is sort of harking back to Velázquez and Velázquez's famous ability to create a whole range of colors out of very few components. So we know that Manet is super passionate about Spain. He's really interested in Spanish painting. I'll finish this with one sort of funny anecdote, which is that he is finally convinced to travel to Spain in 1865 after putting it off. And he goes to Madrid at the recommendation of a friend. And like a typical Frenchman, and I say this as someone my husband is French, he's not quite this close-minded, but when he gets to Spain, all he can do is complain that the food is not as good as Paris. Loves the art, hates the food, never goes back. So he was Parisian at heart and really loved to travel to these other eras and places, pretty much through the paintings that cycle through the Louvre and other art venues, not necessarily in person. But Spain is a fitting transition point because we're going to move on to our next painting, which is John Singer Sargent's Incensing the Veil. And we're in the same room. So this is called the Blue Room. It's on our ground floor, and this is just the other side of it. It's as if we've turned to our right and are looking at another wall. And we're gonna talk about this little guy right here, who's a watercolor. And here's the close-up. It's a watercolor from 1880. And so we can take a quick look at this, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit about Sargent and his background and how he would have gotten to this subject matter. And it does go through Spain, I promise. So here's a picture of John Singer Sargent, who was born, he's American, but he was actually born in Florence in 1856, and he has a very special place in the heart of the Gardner. He and Isabella were very close friends. He painted her portrait in 1888. They connected during those settings, and whenever he was in Boston, he often stayed with Isabella at the museum, which is pretty cool. So this is actually a picture of him painting a portrait commission in one of our galleries in 1903 called the Gothic Room. So he's sort of our golden boy. We have many Sargent works. I'll reference a couple of them. But this particular watercolor is actually, the watercolor I'm going to talk about is from early in Sargent's career, and it's very clearly linked to a quite famous oil painting he did, which is officially not, unfortunately, not in our collection, but this is it. It's called Fumée d'Ambre Gris, and it's at the Clark, just sort of down the road from us in Western Massachusetts. And you'll realize it looks quite similar, but this is an oil on canvas. And when Sargent did this oil, he was really responding to a trend in France at the time called Orientalism. So some of you might be familiar with this. They're 19th century paintings, Orientalist paintings, or 19th century paintings that evoke an exotic Middle East. They're often mixes of cultures. They're not particularly documentary. This is a really famous one also from the Clark by an artist named Jean-Léon Gérôme. And so when Sargent is engaging with this subject matter, he's doing it to kind of compete with guys like Gérôme to give this a shot. And so to just do the comparison between the kind of oil and our watercolor, this is about the scale. So you have the oil on the left, the watercolor on the right, and the watercolor was done after the oil, not in preparation for the oil. He kind of creates a copy of his own painting, and I'll talk about why that is. But a little bit of background about how Sargent even decided or got to North African subject matter. He also went to Spain, which is very close to North Africa. You just have to hop across the Straits of Gibraltar. So in 1879, a 26-year-old Sargent, who's an up-and-coming artist, goes to Spain, and he spent, I think, almost 2.5 months traveling around. He loved it. And we have a sketch here for one of our another famous Sargent in the Gardner, which is a Spanish subject I'll show on the next slide. But basically it gets cold. So he's upset, it gets cold in Spain. He decides to go further south. So he hops across the Strait of Gibraltar, and he goes to Tangier, Morocco, Tunis, and then he goes back to Europe. And so he's on kind of this loop through Spain and North Africa. And so probably the most famous painting that comes out of this trip is also in our collection. It's called El Jaleo. It's a Spanish dance painting. It's very exoticized. It really links Spain to its Moorish or Gypsy past. But we're going to talk about the lesser known, but I think no less engaging, Incensing the Veil. So what do we have here? Sargent's hanging out in and around Tangier, and he sees various cultural customs. And one of them is lighting ambergris, which is a resin from Wales that washes up on the shore. It's used quite a lot in Bedouin culture in North Africa as for healing potentials, potential aphrodisiac potential. So he sees people lighting it on fire and whatnot. Now, to be clear, this image is not of any particular cultural event or ceremony. It's really a mix of things. We think that the woman at the center is someone that he actually hired as a model while he was in Morocco. and he wants to try out different options, different dresses, different settings to create both the finished oil painting and this watercolor later. But what I want to focus on is some of Sargent's amazing ability to create a watercolor that's really just about shades of white. And this is really, really hard to do in watercolor. I don't know if any of you are watercolorists, but it takes a lot of work. So the first thing I'm going to point out is in this corner, we see a little line of graphite. What Sargent is doing in this watercolor is he's working with the paper, quote, in reserve. So he's letting the white of the paper create the white of the background. In oil on canvas, you would have to build this up, layer it to create a steady white background. Miraculously, Sargent can not only do this in oil, but he can do it in watercolor. And he's letting the paper shine through and just using the tiniest little, in this case, line to designate wall from floor. And there's just the bit of gray wash over the top of that wall to give you the sense of depth. Now, if we look in this middle thing where we have the smoke of the ambergris, sort of being burned, or this is where it's being burned, the other thing he's doing, which is sort of amazing, is he's just barely evoking smoke by putting a little bit of blue pigment over the top of this detail, right? So it's super subtle. He's mixed the watercolor with lots of water so that you don't make it seem like it's a hard bit of, so the smoke actually feels ephemeral. Again, quite hard to do. And I think the place where you can see his amazing ability to just use watercolor for what it is, which is this like fluid, watery medium, very different from oil, is here. And so what I want you to look at is around the blue, you'll see around that there's sort of a flood. It looks like he's dropped a drop of water on the paper, and you'll see these kind of like, it's almost like a blue halo that's spread out. We call that a tide line. And so basically what he has the confidence to do is he's mixed lots of water with his pigment. He's taken his brush and he's just let the water plop, just tinged with pigment, and he trusts it to spread out over the paper and to create this sense that there is smoke coming through the air. So if we go briefly back and we think about El Jaleo as being all about black and shadow and this ability to create drama with shadow, actually we can think about In Sensing the Veil as his attempt to do this with whites, just subtly paint in white. And they're from the same trip. So I like to think that he's thinking about light and dark when he's on this trip, and his artwork that he creates after it is reminiscent of that. So if you look in the bottom right corner, you'll see there's kind of a little inscribed note, and we'll finish with this. So why did Sargent create this watercolor after his finished oil? And the key is in this transcription, or in this inscription, oops. And it's because of this guy. His name is Dr. Samuel Pazzi. He was, of all things, and I think you can sort of tell from the painting, a celebrity gynecologist in 19th century France. He had affairs with many, many women, and he was close friends with Sargent. And he loved the oil painting that Sargent did of this subject, and he asked his friend to please make him a copy in the form of this watercolor. So we have it, so thanks to this guy and this kind of dashing red robe, the gardener has a beautiful watercolor by Sargent because Isabella bought the watercolor directly from this guy's estate sale. And there's a wonderful book about him, by the way, called The Man in the Red Coat by Julian Barnes, which is worth a read. So we'll move from celebrity gynecologists in 19th century Paris across our hallway to Henri Matisse's terrace at Saint-Tropez. So I'm going to kind of take you through the space. We're going to walk across. This is actually our current modern art installation. This is literally what the museum looks like right now. So we would kind of walk from the blue room where we were, we'd walk through this contemporary installation. You can see El Jaleo in the background, and we're gonna go into the yellow room. And we're gonna talk about this painting, which Isabella kind of shoved up in a corner there, but I think it's worth a little bit more attention than what her placement would suggest. So this is Henri Matisse's Terrace at Saint-Tropez. It's from 1904, and it is actually the earliest Matisse in an American museum collection, which is pretty cool. I mean, not the, I should say, it is the first Matisse to be added to an American museum collection. There are earlier Matisses in other collections. So who knew that the gardener could be so avant-garde? I'll tell you a little bit about Matisse, and then I'll talk more specifically about this painting. Oh, and I just wanted to point out, because people usually can't see her, that's actually Madame Matisse sitting in a kimono doing some sewing. So she kind of fades into the background, but she's going to be part of the story about this painting. So I always like to highlight her. Okay, so Henri Matisse, like Manet, was actually born into a fairly well-off bourgeois family. He was also expected to become a lawyer. He got further than Manet. He successfully became a law clerk, but then started painting in his spare time and ultimately abandoned the law to become a full-time painter, in part with the support of his wife, Amélie, who was in the painting and is here in this photograph a little bit clearer, although you can recognize her bun, her chignon. And she fully supported him and was actually a studio assistant for many, many years. And this is their daughter, Marguerite, on the right. So when Matisse is first getting started as an artist, he's not maybe the Matisse we think of. He's not sort of a very super modern avant-garde painter. He is creating works like this, which are fairly modern, but still not, maybe not totally over the top in some ways that we might think of. This is called Carmelina. It's 1903. So it's the year before our Terrace at Saint-Tropez. And this is from the MFA Boston. So it's just across the street from the Gardner. So keep in mind, this is 1903. However, by the end of 1904, Matisse paints this, which is in Paris, called Luxe Calme et Volupté. It's which is a title taken from a Baudelaire painting, and you'll see it's a very different feel. We suddenly have psychedelic colors. We have a scene that doesn't make a ton of sense. He's adopted kind of a pointillist, so like these little swipes of color approach to painting. And this painting is considered sort of a breakthrough for Matisse and the beginning of what we call the Fauvist movement, or the Beasts, these painters who use really radical colors to end non-narrative sort of mystical scenes sometimes. And they're a kind of major group of modern artists in Paris at the beginning of the 20th century. So he's moved from this to this in a year. And what's pretty cool is our painting is right in the middle of that. And so this painting, Terrace at Saint-Tropez, was done while Matisse spent a summer in the south of France. Not so bad. He spends about 4 or 5 months from summer into early autumn working very intensively in the south of France. And he's working alongside 2 fellow artists. So on the left, we have Paul Signac, who he's working next to. This is his Port of Saint-Tropez from a couple years earlier, and another artist named Henri Edmond Cross, whose work we can see the watercolor at the right from the Met. And so the comparison, so he's working next to these guys. He's spending the summer in the south of France painting all the time. And the comparison that typically gets made is this one. So on the left, we have Matisse's breakthrough Luxe Calme et Volupté, and on the right we have a Signac painting, also of Saint-Tropez. And you can see why they might be compared. You know, there is this kind of pointillist approach. There's a seaside, there are boats. But what I want you to think about is that Signac's painting is clearly a port scene. It has a narrative. The colors sort of make sense. They create a recession into space. That's less true of Matisse's painting on the left of Luke's Call Me Volupte. So maybe we can look for other influences or other intermediate spaces besides just he's painting next to the sky and he's copying him. And so I'd like to make an argument, of course, because I work at the Gardner, for the importance of the Gardner's canvas. So here we go again. This is our painting. And when you spend some time looking at it, you can see details in this painting that seem to be getting worked out for some of the details of Luke's Call Me Volupte. So I'll pull these up. So this is the tree from the larger painting, and you can see some of the use of his leaves at the front of the terrace here. The choice to put these vines sort of hanging down through the center of the canvas. You see some similar shapes in the tree and Luke's Call Me Volupte. And then I think the last one, and I'm not sure if it's flattering or not to his wife, but this sort of philosopher figure, and then the woman with the bun that are part of this kind of central picnic scene in Luke's Call Me Volupte. You know, the philosopher looks suspiciously to be in the same kind of seated position as Matisse's wife, Amélie, in the middle of this, right? So I like to think that our painting also plays a role in his modern art breakthrough. So I'll just finish by briefly talking about how this painting is even in the Gardner, this work of modern art, and also why it's shoved in the corner of a gallery. So what's funny is that Isabella did not actually buy this painting. It was a gift from her friend, the archaeologist Thomas Whittemore. And Thomas Whittemore was in Europe doing work as a Byzantine archaeologist, and he became friends with Matisse. And he bought this and a series of drawings directly from Matisse. And he comes back to Boston, and he basically says to Isabella, I think this guy is really good. I think you should put him in your museum. And she goes, not sure. But she agrees to take the work on loan in 1910. And so she takes it on long-term loan in 1910, puts it in her gallery, lives with it for a full 12 years before she's finally convinced that actually it is pretty good and okay, she'll take it for free. And so she ended up with this wonderful Matisse for free in her galleries, but I think it's part of the reason it kind of gets shoved up in a corner because she'd prefer to focus on her purchases, but that's a story for another time. And that's about all I have. Thank you very much for tuning in and for spending your morning with me. And I look forward to your questions. Here, and I'll put up the Kalamazoo Art League again for our discussion, but I can also flip back through to certain images if people would like.
Do you have any other questions? Because mine is a not very important one, but I wonder if you would just tell people about the nasturtiums, just because that's so part of the museum.
Yeah, of course. So I'll go back to the courtyard to talk about this. I unfortunately don't have a nasturtium shot. So this is, again, our central courtyard. Isabella was an avid gardener, which is, ironic given that her last name was Gardner, but she sort of won all sorts of horticulture prizes. And one of the things that she and her team of gardeners, and she's a wealthy person, so she has people working for her, were able to create are these hanging nasturtium flowers. And they're incredibly difficult to grow. They grow in a vine, and they get draped actually over the top of these balconies in April when they bloom. And this is a tradition that's been going on at the museum since Isabella's lifetime. And we still do it today. It's our horticulture team spends a lot of time and care. We have offsite greenhouses south of Boston creating these, and it's quite a thing to see them transported very carefully. They're kind of 20-foot long vines of flowers that end up draped over the courtyard. It's quite beautiful. Unfortunately, this year we were closed for COVID when the nasturtiums were happening. So some of them were donated to organizations around Boston. And unfortunately, some of them became compost, but they will be back. Let me see. Diane, would you like me to respond to the chat, or do you want me to, oh, I've got one here, sorry. So I got a question, curious about the theft that I mentioned. Yes, I don't know how, and I'll go on this slide to talk about this. So the theft, which the Gardner is quite well known for, unfortunately, happened in the early hours of March 18th, 1990. So the Gardner was robbed of 13 works of art. The most famous of which is a Vermeer. There are only 36 Vermeers in the world. So it's valued at about $500 million in present value. But they stole a Vermeer, a Rembrandt, two Rembrandts, excuse me, a Chinese work of art, some Degas prints, a Manet small oil sketch. And so basically 2 guys came to the museum dressed as Boston police officers. It was the night of St. Patrick's Day. It was around 2 in the morning the next day. So they figured the cops would be distracted if anything happened, the real cops. They came in, they tied up the guards, and they spent about 2 hours walking through the museum, taking paintings off the wall. In 2 cases, they actually cut the paintings out of their frames or off their stretchers because they were so heavy. And then they got away, and the paintings have never been found. If you guys have any leads on the paintings, I think the reward is either, I think it's $10 million for their recovery. So it's the largest in terms of like dollar amount art theft of all time, and it's certainly the largest unsolved art theft. And the reason I put up this image is most of the works were stolen from the Dutch Room, which is what this is showing us a picture of. And this guy, our little Rembrandt self-portrait, was actually intended to be stolen. They took him off the wall and flipped him around while they were working on getting other art, and they forgot him. So that's very happy news. So I'll circle him, it's him. So this is Rembrandt, age 23. It's one of his earliest self-portraits. And thank God the thieves actually forgot to take him with them. So we still have him. But yeah, it's an ongoing mystery. There are podcasts, there are like documentaries. We'll see what happens. Hopefully they turn up sometime, somewhere in some basement, probably in South Boston. Okay. On the subject of nasturtiums, one of the paintings that caught my eye in the Blue Room is one of nasturtiums in a blue bowl. I forget. Who's that by, and did Isabella acquire it because of her love of nasturtiums? That is a great question. I don't think I have a picture of that painting. Can you see it on this wall? No, it'd be in the corner. I think, and keep in mind, we have a lot of works, and I've only been here for a year, so I think the painting you're referring to is by Isabella's friend, Martin Maurer, who created, let's see, is someone helping me out in the chat? Yes, it's on the upper right. Upper right. Ah, here, yeah. I think this is by Martin Maurer. I'd have to double check. It could be a bunker, but I'm almost sure it's by an artist who is friends with Isabella. So it would have been a specific purchase, if not necessarily a commission, that she was friends with many artists. If her eye is drawn to it, she would often get a good deal on it. So I'm sure that it has to do with her love of nasturtiums. The nasturtium tradition started during her own lifetime, so that would make a lot of sense. Oh, the significance of the cat in Manet's painting. Okay, so we can go to Olympia. This is an ongoing debate that many art historians have weighed in on. So this painting's at the Musée d'Orsay. I won't pretend to be an expert on it. But, you know, it gets, quite frankly, there's so much debate about this painting, the most recent of which is around the presence of this black model who has been identified as Laure. and her role in the painting, that it's been the whole painting's been reinterpreted in the last sort of 4 or 5 years to reorient it towards more inclusion of discussion of Laure, and not just discussing this model who was named Victorine Moreau. So the cat is generally thought of as being linked to 2 things. One thing, Manet had, well, his wife, and at this point he's married, had a cat named Zizi, who was much loved by the Manet family, and he paints and draws a lot. If you look at his sketchbooks, there are a lot of cat drawings. So there is some sort of element of just like an immediacy, and I think a love of cats. The second thing is that the presence of a cat and sort of a house cat is sometimes considered as a further signifier that this is a contemporary scene and not kind of an ancient Greek scene. You know, if we think about this as people might know the figure of Danae, who there's like a golden shower of coins on this naked woman. It's supposed to be Zeus, who's, you know, going to impregnate her with a demigod. You know, there wouldn't have been a house cat in any sort of ancient scene, right? Or any evocation of an ancient scene. So the presence of a pet is just further heightening this sense that this is a contemporary moment and that it's 19th century Paris. And so people can't be confused about what's going on here, which is that it's an image of a prostitute being given flowers by one of her clients. But there's like a ton of literature on this. If you're really interested, I'm happy to recommend some options. But yeah, I don't think anyone could say definitively what Manet was thinking there. So let's see, further in the chat. Year of the robbery, 1990. Yes, thank you. That is right. March 18th, 1990. We just, for better or worse, celebrated the 30th anniversary of the theft. Did anyone else have any more questions they wanted to ask?
I think, I'm not muted right now, right?
No.
Okay, I think that's it. I think our time's about up.
Okay.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh, wait a minute. Somebody has a question, I hear, and he doesn't know how to get it to you. Just a second.
Okie doke.
Okay, never mind. We'll skip that for now, and we'll let him email you or something. I don't know what. Thank you so much, Diana, and I hope you really do make it here to Kalamazoo next year. Thanks. And now, Karen, are you going to kick us off?
Oh, here.
Karen, unmute. Okay, I guess not. Maybe that's it. Well, I think we did pretty good for our first time around. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. This is a real pleasure. And I hope I get to see you all in person. Bye.
Are we still here?
I couldn't